The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis with me, your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And today we got another great show coming up. We got Charles C. Alexander, and we're talking a little bit of dead ball era ball with the Miracle Braves, 1914 to 1916. It's going to be a great show. Even before I begin, holiday season's coming around. You know, not a lot of talk about those Boston Braves because, you know, when you think about it, they moved to Milwaukee. They had some good success there. And now they're the Atlanta Braves. And, of course, the Red Sox overshadow pretty much the whole history of the cities, considering the Braves moved out of Boston in 1953. And I have the good fortune of living up here. And so, believe it or not, a lot of the older timers, they are Atlanta Braves fans because they followed the Boston Braves. And it was handed down through generation and generation. And we're going to get into the whole origins of the team and how they struck gold in 1914. And it's going to be a great, great time with Mr. Alexander. We're going to get to Mr. Alexander and the book in just a second. But, of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho himself. We got so much good programming on in store for you folks. We got Peter Golenbach in Golenbach's University. We got Hal Bach doing the vintage sports with Ralph Tycho. We got Bill Kashadis out of Philadelphia doing Philadelphia baseball. Past, present, future, and of course we don't focus on the Phillies. Hey, we focus also on another team that moved out of the city, the Philadelphia A's, who those Miracle Braves beat in 1914. So, you know, we focus on the Philadelphia Stars and Negro League ball. It's a great show. We got Nancy Finley, the self-proclaimed niece of Charlie O. Well, she's actually a second cousin since her father, Carl, who was his cousin, worked in the front office with Charlie O, and she does Oakland A's baseball, and of course they go back to Kansas City, and, you know, they talk about when she was growing up as a little girl and as a teenager to see those swinging A's in action. Hey, we got Eldon Ham out in Chicago, great sports lawyer, also a great sports writer and newscaster out there, has his own radio show, doing on both White Sox and Cubs. Were honored to have him. Hey, we have Mark in the midday. And that's Mark Littell and Mark Weiss. And, of course, if you don't know who Mark Littell was, I always say it. Hey, he's the one who gave up the home run to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series that sent my Yankees into the World Series against those big red machine. But, hey, the Yankees weren't in the World Series for 12 years. They got to the series. Mark has a lot of good stories, brings on a lot of good guests, and he always makes the network a better place to be. We also got Giants baseball, which I was co-chairing for a little while. We're talking New York Giants baseball. We're talking a little bit about John McGraw and Christy Matheson and Mel Ott and all those guys from the past, and we're talking San Francisco ball, and that's just a great show in of itself. Hey, Dave Nemec is back on the air. I'm going to be on his show today. We got Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia, along with that mensch of all menches, Alan Blumkin, who is Sabres, you know, proclaimed historian. And believe me, doing a show with both these gentlemen that I pretty much read when I was a kid, unbelievable stuff. In addition, if you don't know, this podcast is going to be probably broadcast in about 2 to 3 weeks from now. Congratulations to the Houston Astros for beating the Los Angeles Dodgers. It was a great series. Had a great time in 2017. You know, I'm looking forward to 2018 and beyond, and I think baseball is getting better and more exciting with all these young players that are coming up like Aaron Judge and all the newbies that, you know, you see on TV, and it's really making baseball a watchable game again. So now we turn to the Miracle Braves, and we're dealing here with 3 big years for those Braves of Boston, 1914, 1915, and 1916. And believe me, folks, when I tell you, this is highly forgotten because as we're going to see when I interview Mr. Alexander, who's on the other line, we're going to find out so much stuff and why this was such a pivotal moment in baseball history that by the mid-century when they said, hey, what was the biggest, upsets or, crowning achievements, the Boston Braves of 1914 got that adulation. And if you don't know who Mr. Alexander is, he is the Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus of Ohio University. He's written 13 books, the last 7 which have dealt with American baseball history. Basically, he's interested in the same era I am in, the dead ball era. He's written his book on Ty Cobb back in 1984, Tris Speaker, probably about 11 years ago in 2006, John McGraw. He's working on a new book on the 1908 American League pennant chase, where, of course, they play the Cubs, who was the big dynasty before the Philadelphia A's took over that dynasty in 1910, and coincidentally would end it in 1914 when the Braves beat them in the World Series. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Charles.
Thanks, Ian. Good to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you. Let me ask you something. Why this series of years, why this team attracted you to its story?
Well, first of all, I needed another book topic. Keep me busy, keep me off the streets and out of the bars. It's a fascinating story. It's one that I became aware of when I was a child and was starting to follow baseball and reading about baseball and baseball history. And it was a much bigger story back then, back when the Braves were still in Boston, than it is, of course, today. It's largely unknown outside of, the people who deal in baseball history and SABR and elsewhere. But it is a story really of a renaissance of a franchise that had been in really bad shape for a long time. The Boston National League team dominated the National League in the 1890s. They won 5 pennants in the 1890s. Then the American League came into being in 1901 and carried out massive raids on the National League rosters and basically wrecked the Boston National League team and reduced it to something that at best would approach mediocrity. Generally speaking, they were really terrible teams from 1901 on up until, 1913, actually. And they'd gone through a lot of managers. They'd gone through various owners. And then a group headed by James Gaffney, who was a Tammany Hall big shot and a multimillionaire contractor, bought the team at the beginning of 1913, and it was the beginning really of their comeback. They hired George Stallings, who had already had a long career in baseball, to be the manager. Stallings was known to be tough, demanding, and he was also known for his matchless profanity in the dugout. Of course, he managed from the bench in street clothes, which meant he couldn't come on the field to argue with umpires or whatever, but he gave them hell from the dugout and gave his players hell too. But the Braves pulled off sort of a mini miracle as far as their few fans were concerned in 1913 when they finished in 5th place. Well, that was the beginning of great things. Stallings made some shrewd trades. He had one young pitcher, Bill James, who really came on, had a great season in 1914. And Stallings was an early platoon manager. The term hadn't come into use yet, but he platooned all 3 of his outfielders, left-handers against right-handers, right-handers against left-handers. And he was the first manager to do that. and of course had great success, and it influenced later managers, particularly John McGraw, to switch players, particularly outfielders, depending upon whether the pitcher's left-handed or right-handed. But anyhow, the Braves just ran away with the 1914 pennant. They started out badly, as they always did, but then they went on this incredible streak after the middle of July, and they just blew the New York Giants away. They finished 10.5 games ahead of the Giants. And then they went on into the World Series and swept the mighty Philadelphia Athletics in one of the great upsets in American sports history. But they also continued to be good in 1915 and 16, and finished third in 1915, and finished second, in 1915, and finished third in 1916. Although they won more games than they had won the previous year. So in other words, they continued to be contenders for the next 2 years, which is something that even people are aware of the Miracle Braves of 1914 were not really aware of how good they continued to be for the next 2 years.
And you know, I'm going to step back a bit, because without Gaffney, you got to talk about John Montgomery Ward. Because he was the one who went in with Gaffney. And Ward is such a pivotal, person in baseball history. Not a lot of people know about it. I consider him the Marvin Miller of his day, because he organized against the National League in the 1890s. But I want to let you to tell the story. Give me a little bit about John Montgomery Ward. How did he get involved with the Braves? What his past, he had done, what he brought to the Braves, and why he had to give it up to Gaffney.
Well, John Montgomery Ward was, by the time that he went in with Gaffney to buy the Braves, he was already a famous figure. He had been one of the outstanding players of the late 19th century. He was a college graduate of Columbia, and also had a Columbia law degree. And he other players looked up to him because he had a far superior education to other players in that period, and was a good pitcher before he ruined his arm. And then he went to the second base, and he played with various teams, but he was the key figure in organizing the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players in the mid-1880s. And when they couldn't get what they wanted from the owners, notably modification of the reserve clause and various other concessions, they organized their own league, the Players League of 1890. And most of the good players in the National League and in the second major league of that period, the American Association, went over to the Players League. So the best baseball being played in 1890 was in this rebel league. Well, it seemed like a great idea at the time, but it didn't work out because the financial backers got tired of losing money. In fact, all three leagues lost money in 1890, and so they made their own deals with the National League, abandoned the Players League, and that was the end of that after one season. But Ward went on and managed and played up until through 1894. And then he went into law practice, and he had a successful practice there in New York. And but wanted to get back into baseball, and so he took this opportunity to be the junior partner with Gaffney in buying the long downtrodden Boston Braves. But he and Gaffney didn't get along, and so he sold out and sold out to Gaffney, and that was the end of his association with the National League. But the next year, when the Rebel Federal League was organized to be a third major league, he went over with the Federal League and invested in the Brooklyn Federal League franchise. And of course, the Federal League didn't work out either. It failed after 2 seasons. And Ward went on and continued his law practice. Also became a very good amateur golfer. So he's really a fascinating figure, and part of the fascination is his turbulent marriage with this actress who Helene Duvray. That really wasn't her name. Her name was really Ina Mae Gibson. But they had on and off marriage. There's a lot of stuff in the press about their marital difficulties, and she accused him of having an affair, and so on and so on. So that's the fascinating part of Ward's life as well.
And it's very interesting with Gaffney because, like I told you the other day when we were conversing, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and my friends and family are still there, and I moved to Massachusetts in 1993 to go to law school up here. So like Ward, I was a lawyer and all this other stuff. But the Boston, New York to Boston connection was so far ingrained historically, even before Ruth was traded to the Yankees in 1919. Gaffney was a contractor in New York. And so when he bought the team, he was going to name the team after New York's biggest political institution, Tammany Hall. What's going on with that?
Well, he was a brave of Tammany Hall, a big shot in Tammany Hall who was given the title Brave. Tammany Hall's symbol was the Indian chief named Tammany. So as a brave of Tammany Hall, he had all kinds of connections there in New York City, and to a great extent, he became wealthy exploiting those connections through Tammany Hall and getting, building contracts through Tammany Hall. And he also, he wasn't above resorting to bribery to get what he wanted. He was, to some extent, he was an unsavory character, but every politician in New York City at that time was unsavory. The sheriff of New York County was considered one of the most notorious crooks of his time. The New York-Boston connection, that was much criticized at times, the relationship between the New York Giants and the Boston Braves. And there were various episodes. 1908, for example, there were those who accused the Braves of laying down in a 4-game series at the end of the season, the Giants, so that the Giants were able to sweep those 4 games and then end up tied with the Cubs at the end of the series because of the Merkle blunder that had to be replayed. So, and then in the 1920s, the Braves and Giants by this time the Braves were bad, and the Braves and Giants were accused of having an unsavory, cozy relationship. Basically, the Giants in the 1920s, McGraw, whenever he wanted a player, he just went out and bought it from one of the lesser teams, and he bought several Boston players during that period. There's that part of the Boston-New York connection as well.
And what's interesting here, Charles? You make a couple of good points here. So it's like you got me thinking. In those days, and of course I tell my listeners know, and I told you the other day, I'm doing the whole Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker affair. And one of the things that came out when Risberg opened his mouth and said, well, this stuff goes on all the time. It was well noted back then that a team who didn't make the first division would lay down at the end of the season to give a pennant contender the chance to make a run for the pennant. There was collections made. There was understandings amongst the teams that were going on. In a sense, the Boston Braves were no different than the Kansas City A's of the 1950s to the New York Yankees. They were the New York Yankees farm team.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's certainly true. And in the 20s, the 1920s, particularly the Phillies and the Braves were, quasi-farm teams of the New York Giants within the National League. No, I don't think there's any question that because of a lot of smelly things that had gone on over the years, even going back into the late 19th century, that atmosphere encouraged the White Sox players, those that wanted to throw the series, to do what they did because things had been done in the past and had been gotten away with. And in fact, of course, the White Sox almost got away with that because they played the whole 1920 season and probably would have won the pennant if things hadn't blown up in the last week of the season. So it's unfortunate, if you really love baseball and baseball history, it's really kind of unfortunate when you think back on various things that, I've written about and I know about that went on. Well, for example, in 1891, when the Boston team, then called the Bean Eaters in the National League, they won 18 straight games. Well, and won the pennant to beat out Chicago. Well, it's pretty obvious that the New York Giants laid down in a 5-game series toward the end of the season. And that was critical in the Braves to go on and beat out Chicago for the National League pennant. And I wrote about that at some detail in my book on the baseball in 1890-91, Turbulent Seasons is entitled. There was a lot of stuff that had been going on for a long time. And in fact, the National League was founded in 1876 led by William Hulbert, this Chicago fellow, with the idea in mind of eradicating some of the practices that had been going on in professional baseball and the National Association of Professional Baseball Clubs. So players that had thrown games, players that would show up drunk for games, players that would make bets during the game. Consider the fact that most baseball players had come from a background that was humble background, really. And most of them were not well educated. And that's the only thing they could do was play baseball. I mean, that was their skill. And so some of them had the idea, we're going to make as much as we can while we can, however we have to do it.
And it's funny you mentioned most of them were uneducated, and for the most part they were. So Johnson, Schuler's Joe. I mean, these guys, their careers were upended because of the Chicago Black Sox scandal that happened in 19. And of course, when they put Landis as commissioner, the first thing he did, even though a court of law exonerated all these guys, said, "Hey, you know what? The evidence might not convict him in a court of law, but I'll be damned if these guys are ever going to be back in baseball due to gambling." Now, what's interesting about that was, Van Johnson, who was president of the American League, such a study of contradiction because, like you mentioned, the American League was formed and they raided the National League. You had the whole baseball war from 1901 through 1903. And, Johnson wanted to make baseball better so that women could come. He wanted to get rid of cursing and drinking and fixing games and rowdyism and all that time. But when you go and you listen to Smokey Joe Wood, who, again, in 1912 pitched for the Boston Red Sox, had one of the greatest seasons ever, later blew out his arm and became, pretty good hitter for the Cleveland Indians. When you listen to the tapes, when you hear his tapes, and he's speaking 40, 50 years after the fact, we get a sense that there was more than the public realized about ball being fixed in the dead ball era. Hal Chase, there's another one. And this is where the contradiction comes in with Van Johnson. Because if Johnson was so hell-bent on sweeping up the American League and making it a clean league, they let Hal Chase do pretty much whatever they wanted. They never even touched him because his reputation was that outstanding. McGraw did the same thing when he played for the Baltimore Orioles. Grab the belt, stick your leg out to trip, gamble in the stands, have nice hotels and gambling casinos. Baseball at the time was tainted. Now, George Stallings, son of the South. Why did they pick him? He didn't have such a stellar record before coming to the Braves. What was the attraction by Gaffney on Stallings?
Well, Gaffney had come to know Stallings when Stallings managed the New York American League team in 1909 and 10 and 11, and Stallings had brought a really bad team up to respectability there in New York. At that time, of course, the New York American League team was in a transition from being called the Highlanders to being called the Yankees, but they were still the other team in New York. The big team in New York and the glamour team of New York was the New York Giants, and John McGraw, of course, was one of the foremost figures in New York during that time. And the Yankees were, very much second rate or second class. But Stallings did a good job with them. He couldn't get along with Hal Chase. Hal Chase wanted to manage the team. And Frank Farrell, the owner of the New York American League team, sided with Chase. Stallings resigned, and Chase took over the team, and they fell to, I think, a sixth place the next year with Chase managing them. But anyhow, Gaffney and Stallings were very well acquainted, and Gaffney admired Stallings, admired his managing ability. And so that's how Stallings got hired. He was managing in what later was called the International League, the Eastern League, at that time. He'd had a long career managing in the minor leagues. He'd also managed the Philadelphia Phillies. He'd managed the Detroit Tigers before he got back into the major leagues with the New York Americans, and then was back in the minor leagues. But no, Gaffney wanted him because he thought a great deal of his abilities, and turned out to be right. Stallings, he performed the miracle.
And for the rest of his life, he would be called the Miracle Man. Now, let me ask you this question. We go to 1950. We see that the Boston Braves, 35 years earlier, 1914, 1916, they're still recognized. But when you think about it, that whole notion dies. If you ask people about this, they don't even know. They don't even know about George Stallings. And to just give you an example, and to just give you an example of Stallings' legacy, Stallings, McGraw, who used his tactics, McGraw to Casey Stengel because he tutored Casey when he was on the Giants, Casey to Billy Martin in the 70s and 80s, and of course it just springs out from that because Billy Martin, he coached so many different teams, and he pretty much carried Stallings' way of platooning and tacticians well into the 21st century. But what do you think Stallings did to make this team as prolific as it was? I just want to mention two things. Number one, he was just as stupid as Connie Mack wearing a suit in a dugout on a blistering hot day. The hell's going on with that? I would be sitting there. And number two, his temper. Why would you put up with such a temper? He would just chew his players out. Yeah. Yep. You got the floor.
And he was inordinately superstitious. I talk about some of that, and I write about some of that in the Miracle Braves book about some of his superstitions. Stallings was not as educated as he claimed to be, but he did have a fair education, and yet he really had all these superstitions about litter around the dugout, about having the bats arranged in just such a way. Of course, in those days, you laid out the bats in front of the dugout, and the bat boy's one of his duties was to make sure that the bats were laid out straight. But there's all these superstitions. He had this fiery temper, but then off the field, he was a poised and gentleman, and was he would apologize to players after the game, saying, "Well, I didn't really mean all that. It was just in the game." And he was like Mac in that respect. Mac would always talk to his players about what they had done wrong after the game. Stallings, of course, would jump all over him during the game. But oftentimes he would apologize for bawling these players out. So he's a very complex man, and he's due a biography, I think. I'm not going to do it, but somebody should.
It's funny. Great guys like this, like Stallings and Bill Dickey from the Yankees, they don't have biographies out there. And I'm like, well, what's going to be my next topic? And, I love the dead ball era just as much as you do. And you can tell that I've read up on it. And I loved your books. And this particular one, to me it ranks up from whenever I read from you in Ty Cobb and, of course, Spoke. And I love Speaker. Through you and through Timothy Gay, I learned so much about Speaker that when people ask me about my all-time team, Speaker would play center field. And if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have said Willie Mays. And Willie Mays would probably come in second now, or first. But you threw Speaker into my back burner of my brain, and he's been there. And he's also from Texas like you are, and another blistering hot guy who managed, but who also was a great manager. People forget. That whole incident in 1920. I mean, look, you had the whole incident when Crawford got hit in the head with the ball. Was it Crawford? Who was the one who got hit in the head in the ball?
Ray Chapman.
Ray Chapman. And so he had to.
Ray Chapman.
He had to gather his team, and they went on to win the 1920 World Series while the whole Black Sox scandal was coming up, while the American League was ready to revolt and go to the National League and say, the heck with you, Ban Johnson. You don't know what the heck you're doing. Or even with the thing of getting Landis into the position of commissioner, and the year that he was made to resign, he came in a close second to the New York Yankees. So, people don't know about Trispica. People don't know about George Stallings. And Stallings, I agree, gives you enough meat, I think, to write about, because he is that important. And like I mentioned, his platooning, his management style. I wouldn't want to wear a suit though in a dugout. Him and Mac were absolutely out of their minds. But if you were going to go back to the Victorian era, I guess that's what you did. Tell me about Johnny Evans.
Yeah. Well, I was just about to say that up until you get in the 20th century, those managers who weren't player managers, didn't wear a uniform, in other words, and play the game, they all wore suits and hats and sat on the bench. Ned Hanlon at Baltimore, for example, he had quit playing, so he went to managing. He wore his street clothes when he managed. And that was just the style of the late 19th century, and that's the period that Connie Mack came out of. As far as Stallings was concerned, well, he was a player in the late 19th century. And he, I don't know why he didn't wear a uniform, but he didn't, and therefore he had to stay on the bench.
Hey,
but you have to keep in mind that the uniforms of that day were pretty hot, also in high summer.
Yeah.
They were made of woolen flannel, and and when they get wet, you actually had considerable extra weight in the uniform itself. But anyhow, that's another subject. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
You can't talk about these teams without talking about Johnny Evers. And this was a pivotal move because Evers was huge in Chicago for a whole decade, along with Tinker and Chance, and that great double play combo. And he won 3 world championships. Had a bad season, I think, in 1912, but he was named the manager. He has a fight with the Cubs management. The Federal League now is planning to do the same thing that the American League did a decade earlier.
Right.
What's going on with Johnny Evers?
Well, he had a big offer from the Federal League, and he could have gone to the Federals. He was a much sought-after player, and there was a shrewd move the way the Braves were able to work out the deal and get him. But you know, what I point out, though, in the book is that from our perspective, you might say, well, what was all the big deal about Johnny Evers? He wasn't a great player. He had, obviously, he was a very good baseball player. He wouldn't have been playing at that level. But it was his personal attributes, his charisma, his fiery temper and leadership. That's what people admired about Evers. And he was a pretty good hitter and a decent second baseman, but he really wasn't anything special. As a ball player, there were much better players, much better second basemen, for that matter, in his day. But there was something about Evers that people thought that, well, you know, the Braves are going to get Evers, and things are going to change for the Braves. Well, they got Evers, and things did change.
You know, it's interesting because we're talking about a team. If you told me in May of 1914 that the Braves are going to mount this massive comeback when they started the series, you know, the whole season really, really terribly. You know, and part of their success, I think, was a guy like Evers, and part of the success was also the pitching staff. Now let's talk about the pitching staff, because you got 2 guys on there who are pretty prolific. I think they both won 26 games each. I'll let you tell.
Yeah, actually, they had the big 3, as Stallings called them: Rudolph and James and Lefty Tyler. And Tyler, of course, won 18 games. But James was basically a rookie, a big guy, and he had that big year and then developed arm trouble, and he never was much after that. Rudolph was a smallish fellow, about 5'9.5", 165 pounds or so, spitball pitcher, and which, of course, was perfectly legal back in that day. And those 3 carried the Braves, and that's, you know, there's a point there in my narrative where Stallings just tells the team, these 3 guys are going to carry us, and they did. Of course, in those days, if you started a game, you were expected to finish the game if you possibly could, unless you were really getting knocked around. And there was no such thing as relief pitchers recognized as such. Guys out in the bullpen were, generally speaking, people who were not good enough to start. And sometimes I think that's still true, you know. These guys out in the bullpen that are getting paid millions of dollars a year, they come in and blow the game. But it was not at all unusual in those days for managers to rely on, say, 3 pitchers. Pitch 75% of the time. And so, again, that was the so-called dead ball era, and pitching dominated. And so, to a great extent, the people that we remember from that period are the great pitchers, Walter Johnson and Cy Young and Ed Walsh and so on and so on, who did absolutely amazing things as pitchers. You know, you cannot imagine in today's formularized way that managers handle their pitchers. We cannot imagine that Ed Walsh, for example, would pitch, you know, as he did in 1908, 450-something innings, win 41 games. You know, that's just it's unbelievable from our perspective. And Rudolph and James and Tyler They didn't pitch that much, but they still piled up a whole lot of innings by comparison with Kershaw. Kershaw, for example, is generally considered the best pitcher of this bid. Well, he throws 150, 160 innings a year. So 6 innings, look to the bullpen.
Now it's like bullpen by committee. Years ago, I had the good fortune, maybe bad fortune, because I would have liked to see in the 50s and 60s, but I was born in 70. And I had the good fortune of seeing the birth of the closer, Goose Gossage on the Yankees, and Sparky Lyle, and, Jesse Orozco on the Mets, and these big closers. But let me ask you a good question. I'm going to make you think on this one. Would you compare the importance of these 3 pitches on the Braves to the pitching dominance of Allie Reynolds, Vic Raschi, Ed Lopat in the 1940s and 50s, and Smoltz and Glavine and Maddox in the 90s?
Well, I think they're comparable. Of course, the 3 trios that you've mentioned as you go along, from the Braves trio to Reynolds, Raschi, and Lopat, then you get on to Glavine and Maddox and Smoltz. They piled up fewer innings each time as you go along. Now, they pitched the more complete games than pitchers are pitching now, but still, the number of innings from the Braves trio on down, there is a decline. And after all, the Yankees had Joe Page as their big reliever. That's what he did. He came in. But the thing was that with Page, and then later on with Elroy Face, who was 18-1 in 1959 with the Pirates, entirely in relief. There was the reliever, the big reliever, and he would be called in the 5th inning, or the 7th inning, or the 8th inning, or the 9th inning, whenever he was needed, and he would pitch as many innings as it took to win the game. So that's the way that Elroy Face won 18 games as a relief pitcher in 1959. And relief pitchers would typically, the big Gossage, Page, pitchers of that caliber, they would typically end up with 10 or 12 wins at the end of the season, because they pitched enough innings to be the winning pitcher. And now you've got guys that will end the season 2-3 with a good run average or something, but they will have pitched 50 innings. So it's, I don't want to, I can get started on that because I absolutely despise the way that managers handle their pitching staffs now. And what happened with Rich Hill the other night? He struck out, 6 guys in 4 innings, and Roberts took him out. Wow.
Well, that's because, they see something according to what wasn't present back then, was the sabermetrics, and he's going to play the computer, what the computer says, rather than what his own intuition is telling him. Yeah. That's what baseball's become.
Right.
Scouts, owners, and I have this argument. I said, look, Casey Stengel didn't have sabermetrics. Connie Mack didn't have sabermetrics. McGraw didn't have sabermetrics. They just didn't put your numbers into a computer and say, well, your arm is going to start getting tired at the 80th pitch. Warren Spahn and Juan Marichal in that famous game between them, Spahn was in his 40s and Marichal was 26 at the time. And these guys threw 16 innings. Jack Morris in 1991 in the World Series for Minnesota. Verlander in the American League Championship Series went 9 innings. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason now, Kershaw's 28 years old. They want him around well into the 40s because of his prolific arm. They don't want to blow out their arms. I got the good fortune of speaking to a lot of ex-players, Fritz Peterson being one of them. This guy pitched 300 innings a year. Him and Mel Stoudemire on the Jim Palmer. These guys, these guys went the distance. Even Glab and Smoltz and Maddox, they pitched well into the 7th, 8th inning. You'll never see a 300-game winner. The reason why you got people like Walter Johnson and Cy Young winning as much as they do, as well as Warren Spahn, because they pitched. I did a show on Pud Galvin last month,
Yeah.
And without the biases of Major League Baseball, that they didn't recognize the International League, Pud Galvin pitched doubleheaders in one day. He could have been the third person to win 400 games because they discount 50 of his games, and he finished up with, I think, 341 wins. He was the first 300-game winner because he pitched so much. It was only 2 pitches back then. Cy Young is another thing. Walter Johnson had, 110 complete games? I mean, you'll never see that again. Now, here's a good question for you. Why, after so much bad blood between the American League and the National League a decade earlier, with the building of Fenway Park, with the Red Sox being the city's number 1 team, why would they share the park with the Braves for the 1914 World Series? What did they get out of it, the Red Sox?
I cannot give you a number figure, but I'm pretty certain that the Red Sox ownership got a nice percentage of the gate, and it was in the 14 series, the 2 home games that the Braves had were both capacity crowds. Whereas, the last game of the 1912 World Series, there in Fenway Park, there were a whole lot of empty seats because of the big furor over the Red Rooters and the Royal Rooters, rather, and taking their seats and then being driven out of their seats and so on. Left a lot of bad blood there among the members of the Red Sox Rooters Club. But anyhow, it was funny. It was a good deal for the Red Sox ownership, for Jim Lannon, Jim Lannon, to turn the ballpark over to the Braves for the series. And then, of course, the next year, the Red Sox played the World Series in their home games, played it in Braves Field, which was the new Braves Field, and was much bigger than the Fenway Park was. In fact, it was the biggest ballpark in the world when it opened in late 1915.
And it's funny because it just shows you, in 1914 they didn't even have a park. It was first being built. Wrigley Field wasn't Wrigley Field. It was part of the Federal League. The Yankees the Yankees played at the Polo Grounds. I don't know how McGraw let that happen. And then when Babe Ruth, of course, becomes the shining star of New York and literally dethrones John McGraw as the media circus darling, he said, get the hell out of the stadium. So they built Yankee Stadium right across the river there. And you could actually walk to the Polo Grounds. I find that funny because, people today are like, what? I mean, the only 2 teams that really share a stadium is the Giants and Jets in football. But years ago, the Giants played at Yankee Stadium. Actually, they played at the Polo Grounds. They played at the Polo Grounds. And now Yankee Stadium was built. Rupert, built the stadium. And now the Giants go there. They took the contract away in the 1950s. And the Mets played at Shea Stadium. And, you used to see it all the time. Now everyone got their own stadium. So it's kind of paradoxical, especially with that kind of bad blood that happened a decade earlier, that the leagues would actually agree to do such a thing. Now, let me ask you something with the leagues.
Well, another thing is that there were numerous ownership changes in both leagues after 1903, after the settlement with the American League. In 1914, obviously the Braves were under different ownership, and so were the Red Sox, for that matter. And they've been, as I said, several. In other words, the guys that hated each other so much in 1901 and 1902 were largely gone a decade later. So in terms of the ownership. So that's one explanation why the Red Sox and the Braves, had this amicable relationship there.
And internally in 1913, baseball was at a crossroads in 1913. In 1912, you mentioned the Royal Rooters, they didn't get their seats. Well, you know what happened in Game 6 of the World Series in 1912. They were supposed to start Smokey Joe that day. They didn't because McAllister wanted to, get gate receipts because, they had to have a tie. They needed an extra game, and all this stuff went on. And so Joe had told his brother and his friends to bet on the game, and he didn't start that day. They lost. And so, when Game 8 was being played, no one expected it. And so the Royal Rooters seats were taken up on a first-come, first-served basis. There was almost a riot that was going on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the mounted police had to come in and push the Royal Rooters back and pushed a large number of them completely out of the ballpark.
But now let me ask you this very important question. A lot of people don't know about the Federal League. And I know I'm very good fortune that I've read books on it. I understand the Federal League. And I know that when I look back on Judge Landis's case, he loved baseball so much. And he was such a huge antitrust judge, in the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt, where he's going to bust trusts. That when the case came to his courtroom in 1916, he couldn't even rule on it because he knew that the Federal League was right in their antitrust violations accusations. And 6 years later, the Supreme Court wouldn't touch it either, denied the Federal League, saying baseball does not go towards the antitrust. Antitrust has no place in baseball, which is still true today because that case, the Federal League versus the Major League Baseball, is still good law, although it's been changed in Congress by congressional law. Now, let me ask you this. Even though for 2 years the Federal League was in existence, how prolific was it in rating baseball, changing salaries, and actually giving Major League Baseball a run for its money?
Oh, well, the National League particularly suffered losses of players to the Federal League, and Stallings, after the 1914 season, acknowledged that the National League had been weaker in 1914 than in 1913 because of losses to the Federal League, and particularly the Philadelphia Phillies were really hurt by the Federal League. The American League less so, and the big stars, Jackson, Cobb, Speaker, so on, Johnson, remained in the American League. So but in general, I would say that the Federal League had the effect of weakening the caliber of play in the two existing major leagues, and of raising salaries because, a lot of these guys were, all of a sudden, they were in a negotiating position, and they could demand a lot more money in exchange for not jumping to the Federal League. Some jumped to the Federal League for more money. And, of course, the Federal League also did not have the reserve clause, which was very attractive. But, no, the overall effect was to boost salaries in the American National League. And then, once the Federal League went out of business, the owners embarked upon an austerity program and cut salaries where they could, except in those cases where players such as Matheson and Cobb had signed long-term contracts. But you know what happened with Speaker? He's paid $18,000 a year in 1914 and 15, and then Joe Lannon, the owner of the Red Sox, wanted to cut his salary in half in 1916. and offered him a contract for $9,000. Well, the Speaker, of course, refused to sign it and ended up being traded to Cleveland and, went on to greater glory there in Cleveland. But that was just being done in 1916. It was just the owners were determined to retrench, and they did. And salaries didn't. See, this is another thing that figures into the Black Sox scandal, is that everybody says, well, Charles Comiskey was a cheapskate, and the players, understandably, they fixed the World Series because they were so badly underpaid. They were not badly underpaid at all. Comiskey had retrenched, but along with all the other owners, salaries in general in the major leagues were lower from 1916 up to 1919 into the 1920s than they had been through 1915. So it's, that whole business of why the players did what they did is more complicated than it's oftentimes been made out to be. I personally do not think that the White Sox players were underpaid in 1919. I don't think that could possibly be a justification for what they did. They did what they did because they saw the chance for some big time easy money. And I'm satisfied with that.
Yeah, you have the characters. The big argument is, look, well, should Shoeless Joe, should have gotten his, unfair thing. How about Buck Weaver? All he did was know about it, and Landis.
Right.
Both of them. But my question here now lies, and we'll address that because Eddie Collins was on the team, and one of the things about Eddie Collins is, he played with Eddie Plank, and Plank jumped to the Federal League, and he played for the St. Louis Terriers, I think, if memory.
Right.
But the bitterness that Major League Baseball had against those who jumped to the Federal League, almost like Happy Chandler issuing a 2-year, barman if you went to the Mexican League, because the Mexican leagues were playing, Sal Magui Barber went there, and, these guys couldn't come back to baseball. They were being punished. The Hall of Fame punished Plank. And Eddie Collins, and Collins played with a lot of good players. He said Eddie Plank was the greatest pitcher he ever saw. And for years, they didn't recognize that 20 games that Plank won in the Federal League. It wasn't until 1968 that they added that 20 games to his win total to give him over 300 wins, 305. And so what you have here in 1919 is, you have Kaminsky who's not willing to pay, for them to clean their clothes. They have penny pinching ways, and now you have Rothenstein in New York, and you got all these insiders saying, hey, look, we got $100,000 on the table. You'll get 10,000. You'll get 10,000. You'll get 10,000. Well, Shoeless Joe was in on it, but he retracted. He's like, you know what? And his numbers reflect that he actually played his hardest. Buck Weaver just knew about it, but he stuck his head in the sand. Now, do you think it was justified by Landis to not exonerate these two, whereas he exonerated Collins? And, Risberg calls them the White Lilies, because they didn't get any punishment.
Yeah. No, Joe Jackson, of course, obviously is one of the great players of his time. He was guilt by association, or guilt by implication. But some years ago, I had a student in my American baseball history course who undertook a very close study of Jackson's play in the series. And, for example, he pointed out that Jackson was an expert base runner, but he got caught off base 3 times during the series. He made a couple of bad throws. I don't know. We'll never know what was going on in Joe Jackson's head. We know that he hit well, but otherwise, did he play that well? So, it's, there's what Hal Bach has just come out with still another book on the 1919 series. I think there are more books I think that have been written about the 1919 World Series maybe than about the Pearl Harbor attack by this time. It's amazing the hold that episode has on people's thinking. Really amazing.
You know what's funny? I had Charles Fountain on the show to do his book on the Betrayal 2 years ago because he wrote stuff. For me, I covered the scandal that happened a few weeks before the White Sox, that whole Dutch Leonard thing. But let me ask you this question. I'm going to be ending the show soon. We're running out of time. I'm going to ask you two more questions. Joe Jackson was not a smart guy. He was illiterate. And from a point of view for the game itself, even if he was picked off 3 times, even if he made bad throws, the fact of the matter is that the lawyers got to Jackson. He asked for a lawyer, and they said, oh, no, you don't need a lawyer. Just tell us the truth, and you'll be exonerated. And he was stupid. He didn't know. I mean, he was ignorant. And he confessed.
He was a very smart player.
Yeah.
You couldn't be as great player as he was without having baseball smarts.
Right.
But certainly he was an innocent. Yes.
Right.
It sort of reminds me of It sort of reminds me of my oldest friend who's been married and divorced 3 times, and each time with the divorce he let one lawyer handle both his wife and his case. Well, that's a bad mistake. Jackson, Jackson was, and the others say, oh well, Comiskey's lawyers, they'll take care of you. Well, that's a setup there. So.
One final question, and I'm going to end the show. You got the chapter here. It's labeled its most romantic episode. The whole 1914 Braves coming back from so far, winning the division by 10.5 games, upsetting the great Connie Mack and the Philadelphia A's. First sweep in World Series history. Was its most romantic period?
It was probably, I guess it's how you define romantic, but if you define romantic as something that enraptures people and brings them to a kind of experience that they would not have had otherwise, not an ordinary World Series. It was romantic in that sense, and that here's a team that a bunch of nobodies for the most part that did something that nobody could possibly have imagined that they could do. And so, it's a romantic episode in that respect. It's sort of like, the stand at Thermopylae or something or other. It's heroic. And, I had a lot of fun writing about it and coming to understand, as best I think I can, George Stallings, who's a complicated guy. But anyhow, I had fun writing about it. I've had fun with all of my books. And by the way, you mentioned Speaker as a Texan. I wrote a biography of another Texan, Rogers Hornsby.
Right.
And in some respects, I like that biography better than any of the 4 biographies that I have written.
I'm going to tell you this.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you this.
Yeah.
We're going to get you back on the show because when I end the show, I'm going to ask you to send me the McGraw book, the Hornsby book, and and the new book that's going to be coming out on the 1908.
It's called The Half Game Pennant because it's the only time that the pennant winner ended up winning it by only a half game. Very peculiar circumstances, which you can read about.
And I love all your stuff. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to end the show now. Did you have a good time today?
Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
It's always good. I'll tell you what. I'm going to have you on my show if you so desire. a few times during the year, because you know what's coming up? I got a show coming up on literally the ball itself and how it's changed through the years, like the 19.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, and the cork, and during World War I and World War II is different, and now it's different. It was, and did it really make a difference from dead ball to live ball era, where you can't spit on it, you can't black, if you ask Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner, they'd say, well, there's no difference in the ball. It's just that you got to keep changing balls and the way you choke up. We can get into a whole discussion. We'll get you back for the dead ball era. We'll get you back for McGraw. We'll get you back for Hornsby in the 1908. So just hold the line, folks. I've been reading Charles Alexander for 30-something years now, since I picked up the Ty Cobb book in my high school library back in 1987. Yeah, I know I'm dating myself, but hey, I was 16, 17 back then. I just spoke to, one of my heroes back then, and one of the great authors, and I always say that to Peter Golenbach and Hal Bach. I said, I read you guys, for God's sakes, in the late 70s, early 80s. Hal Bach used to, have a whole series of 1977 stars of Major League Baseball. And they used to, in my elementary school, I used to love to look at the pictures and see what's going on. But, folks, when you have authors of this caliber on the show, you learn something, I learned something, and that's what I'm here to do, is to teach. So my advice is this. Go out, get the Miracle Braves. It's definitely worth the read. Charles is very easy to understand, very clear writing, very interesting topics. You can see that he's passionate about this era of ball, the dead ball era. Of course, you folks know I run the Ty Cobb and the dead ball era site on Facebook, which has about 4,000 people in it. We have Cindy Cobb and Herschel Cobb in there. We got Charles Learson, who used some of Mr. Alexander's work for his book, Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty. Keep reading, folks. Go out, put this under your Christmas tree, menorah, whatever holiday you're celebrating, because it's November. Well worth sitting in on a snow day and reading this book. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Charles Alexander, for being on the show. And, of course, I'm signing off from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, folks, you know it. Good night and good luck.